A very good evening to all our viewers and welcome to this week's edition of The Agenda. My name is Taiwan Jabela. We are continuing with the social distancing conduct of the show given the circumstances currently around the issue of COVID-19. But tonight I'm particularly excited because the show can not get bigger than it will be tonight as I introduce my guests. First, the is Tom Alweendo. He's the current Minister of Mines and Energy here in Namibia, and also former Reserve Bank Governor, Bank of Namibia Governor. That makes him actually a very uh, big expert on the issues of the economy, and it is in that context more that we are engaging him tonight rather than his capacity as minister. Of course, from time to time that might come in the conversations, but we are engaging Tom tonight in the context of his background in the economic space. Welcome, Minister, to the show. Thank you for making time.
Thank you very much, Toivo, for inviting me to participate on your show, and good evening to all the viewers.
Indeed. And we have also Dr. John Steytler. He is also a renowned economist. He worked until not too long ago as economic advisor to President Hage Geingob. He worked as a senior official at the International Monetary Fund some years ago. So he's also very well versed on the subject of the economy, and that is what the show is about tonight. John, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Toivo, and also good evening to all the viewers.
Wonderful. We'll start with you, John, and that is with what you yourself termed as the week that was, in reference to, of course, particularly the regulations announced on Wednesday by President Hage Geingob. You know, there was a lot of fear, there was a lot of panic and speculation as to what will transpire as far as the new regulations are concerned. And I mean, the president has the obligation to protect both the economy and lives, so it's a thin line to walk, really. What did you make of the regulations, John?
I think actually the weeks that have been for some time now, we're in the midst of the third wave, and I want to use this opportunity to single out one particular group of people that we call the frontline workers. What struck me in one of the newspapers was that picture of two nurses hugging each other and just realizing the endurance of the frontline workers. And we have to really commend them that they keep on going back, they keep on fighting, they keep on supporting, and they are there. Now, with respect to the regulations, it was really very difficult, and in my view, I think government has managed to strike a good balance between restricting movements throughout the country, but also trying to keep the economy open. And because we cannot afford a complete shutdown like during a very first lockdown that we had. So I think there will still be scope for economic activities. Obviously, it will be at a reduced basis, but I think overall there's a good, the balance was very good, but it's also up to us as citizens to bring our part. Because if we are still going to behave as if it's business as usual as citizens, then all these measures are really not going to be very helpful. So I think overall, in my view, the regulations from an economic perspective, they were not excessive, and the government has managed to keep businesses open. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, John. Tom, for you, it's even more trickier because you are in the political space, you are part of the collective in the political space. Therefore, you have to make political decisions, but also economic decisions. What was your impression yourself?
Yes, Toivo, I think I'll probably start by saying we're really living in very difficult times. when the first time when the coronavirus was announced in early of last year, uh, I guess we all then realized that it was a difficult thing. It was a shock to all of us. But I think somehow we thought, it's a couple of months and it would disappear. It would go away. More than a year later, we are still here. And not only here, we have really lost a number of people. We've got a lot of people who are in hospitals. So we're really living in a very difficult times, and our hearts goes out to those who have lost their loved ones, those who are still in hospitals. As John says, the front line workers, the nurses, the doctors, those are doing a tremendous and difficult jobs on our behalf. So it's a very, very tough time. Now, with having that tough time, unfortunately, we also need to still to continue to do what is necessary. And that is why I think the last round of pronouncement by the president and also by the Minister of Health, the whole focus one was that how do we really continue to make sure that we do save their lives, but at the same time we also make sure that we do not close off the economy totally, because that will be equally more devastating. And therefore, really, what we just try to do, just to restrict their movement as much as we can, because as was said by the Minister of Health, is that the virus has got no license. It doesn't actually drive from one place to another place. It's us who take to those places. So the measures taken by the government right now is really to restrict their movement, but we also want to do that in such a way that we still leave some of the economic activity going, so that at least we can continue to have our livelihoods as much as we can. It was not as easy. It's not an easy. We hope at least now in the next 2 weeks, the numbers of infection will come down, and hopefully then we can review them in such a way that we can open up a little better. But it's really, very difficult.
Thank you, Minister, for that elaborate answer. John, what we have seen in the past maybe 14 months or so now, since we recorded our first case in the country, is that we have also learned certain lessons, because when Corona first came, it was this enigma that we didn't know much about, and we've learned to live with it in some ways. If you look at the first lockdown that was announced last year, and the drastic impact that it had on the economy, do you see a sense of measurement in the current ones compared to the last one, to the last year's one? Maybe saying, we have learned that to shut down the economy in the manner that we did last year was a bit too alarmist, and therefore this time around we have to be a bit moderate. Do you see a sense of moderate measures in this particular one?
I think that the first lockdown was a very hard lockdown, and it was needed at that point in time. And I can also argue that if the lockdown was not that hard, the situation today could have been worse, because the intention of the first lockdown was to prepare ourselves for what was to come. And and maybe some people may question and say, but we have not been prepared. But I think some spaces were created, and then when this big tsunami came now, although it's so devastating, it's still better than if we did not take the time of the lockdown to prepare. The question is, could we have done more? Perhaps we could have done more to prepare for the second and the third wave. So I would argue that yes, this is the first lockdown was very, very hard, but it served a specific purpose. And also during the first lockdown, we had more weapons in the ammunition in the fiscal space and the monetary space that we could use to support households, But at this point in time, I don't see the fiscal space for households. And so we have to try and keep the economy as much as possible. Also, Toivo, on some economic sectors, it's actually difficult to keep them open because it's outside of our control. Take, for example, tourism. Because of the high infection rate, high positivity rate, we have been classified as a high-risk country. So internationals, they cannot come here now. So some of these lockdowns is coming also because of the situation that we face. And although it's not a lockdown, but the tourists are not going to come. But at least some of the other sectors we can still keep going. But it's important that we practice safety measures in those sectors that are open.
Thank you, John. Minister Alweendo, what is how much damage do you think COVID-19 has done to our economy, which was already really going through a rough patch prior to the arrival of the virus? But just maybe in the past 12 to 14 months, so how much damage do you think this virus has done to our country and our economy in particular?
Yeah. Okay. Just maybe on a bit on your earlier question with regards to the first lockdown and currently, because you seem to be suggesting that maybe we were too harsh with the measures that were taken then. And with hindsight now, maybe would have done a little bit better. I don't think what we knew then would have made us to act any differently in terms of shutting down the economy, as you term it. Because at the time, really, the most important measures that we wanted to make sure that we put it in place is to really to prevent the transmission coming into the country, and that's why the borders were closed. That's why only essential services were permitted to be performed. Which, if you look at it really closely, it does not really differ much from what we have now. Borders, although the borders are open now, not anybody can just come in. I mean, number one, you have to come in only if you can prove that you have been tested and you have negative result. The essentials that can be imported through the borders are still being imported, just like it was during the first lockdown. The essential service that can be provided by the Namibians, whether within a lockdown area or outside that lockdown area, it still continues the same. So essentially, there's not really much of a difference between what it is now and then what it was then. Because even then, for example, we still have got some sectors that were open. The mining sector, for example, was still allowed to do some minimal work, which not shut down completely. Although they were required to make sure that at least they do adhere to certain or to the protocol that were advanced then. So the two systems more or less talk to each other. But obviously, with everything else, you learn lessons as you go on. People become more adaptive. Obviously, you learn new things you didn't know at the time. Now, with regard to how this have impacted the economy, there's no doubt. It's true. I think even before COVID, our economy was not really in a good space. COVID just made it worse. And if you look at the recent NSA statistic that the economy have shrunk. And that's to be expected. For example, if the figures I've seen, all the sectors, whether it's a primary sector, whether it's secondary sectors, all the sector basically contracted. I mean, apart from the ICT, all the sector has contracted, and that's really to be expected, because whether it's in terms of our export, for example, we are probably not exporting as much as we used to export anymore, because those who used to buy our goods are no longer in a position to do so. The tourists who used to visit us are no longer visiting us. So it's a little to be understood, and therefore, going forward, we really got a lot of work to do and figure out how do we then still revive the economy, depending obviously on how long the COVID pandemic continues. So, but there's no doubt that the economy has really shrunk because of the COVID-19.
Thank you, Minister. We are going for a small commercial break, and we'll be back shortly.
If you're feeling how I'm feeling, and you know I won't stop. All we gotta do is take our love to the top. If I got it and you want it, and you'll never let it drop. All we gotta do is take our love to the top. I will ride for you, baby, even die for you. When I'm loving you, but my heart don't stop.
We are continuing with the agenda. Of course, like I said in the beginning, I'm very excited to have Dr. John Steytler on the panel with Minister Tom Alweendo. Gentlemen, we continue. John, the you know this COVID-19 situation cannot just be looked at in the context of health and people dying and all that. There are so many far-reaching implications of particularly the deaths. This past week, a couple of weeks rather, we've had traditional leaders like Advocate Vekiru Koro. We had Umbara Philos Ngubauba of Ambandero also passing away. We had Dr. Zed Ngavile, who was still in the midst of a very important conversation with Germany, also passing away. Do you see just how much this whole COVID thing stretches beyond what the eye meets? What can you tell us about it?
I think, Toivo, one of the news headlines, and that was in the Namibian Sun. Unfortunately, not a headline, but there was an interesting survey, the Gallup survey, that focused on the mental impact that COVID-19 has globally. And in that one of the headlines was the post-looming crisis. And there are predictions that, after we have defeated COVID, one of the looming crises will be to deal with all this grief that people are experiencing, that because we are, for example, if you look how we grieve in Namibia when there's a death, we cannot grieve as usual. But apart from the grieving process, which is separate, there's also a lot of uncertainty, anxiety at the workplace, in families. So these are things that will still play itself out after COVID. In terms of if you look at the people that are passing, apart from the grief, it's also a combination of people. I would say some big trees that have fallen, And that wisdom, maybe it's just gone, like overnight. Suddenly we don't have it. And other people have to step in, but there was no proper handover. There was no handover brief. But also there's younger people that have potential that's in the in the highly productive sector that have also fallen. So we are dealing with post-COVID or that breakdown in knowledge just happened like that. Been trying to build capacity, knowledge for a long time. Now suddenly we have a lot of gaps, and we will struggle to rebuild that capacity. But as I said before, other things that's really very challenging in particular in African societies, how we grieve is different than how the rest of the world grieve. We are denied that opportunity to grieve. There's a lot of anxiety, but also in other societies, people speak open about it. In our society, it's kind of almost a taboo to say that I feel down or uh, I'm afraid what tomorrow may hold. So we bottle up a lot of things, and that may still come out and also affect going forward.
Minister, thank you, John. Minister Alweendo, I want to pose the same question to you. Just the institutional memory that we are losing, not only as a people, but even as government. I mean, if a person like Dr. Ngabirwe passes on, just as an example, I mean, where do you even start? Thankfully, he had almost ran the race fully as far as that subject is concerned. But still, he went down with so much wisdom and information and institutional memory. So broadly speaking, how impactful are these deaths to society?
Yeah, Toivo, this is, as I said, it's very hard. When people started to succumb from the disease last year, you hear one person died of COVID, maybe two people died of COVID. But when suddenly you hear in a space of a couple of weeks, you've got hundreds of people who have died, then that's when you realize how this serious it is. Because then, before, when you hear somebody who have died, it's a statistics. It's somebody who have died, somebody you don't know. But suddenly, most of us are able to put names and faces to those who have died. Most of us, many families, many households, we are all affected. And therefore, it's no longer just a statistic, it's really people we know. And as you say, in the last couple of weeks, our leaders, people who were really pillars in our communities, have succumbed to this disease. And obviously, it leaves a very big void in our community, in our households. But we just hope that we will be able to go through this, to rebuild as we go, to accept that this is something we need to deal with. Although it's going to be difficult, as John was saying, for example, one of the things where we are now even no longer able to mourn our departed the way we would want to mourn them, the way we are accustomed to how to mourn. And that's just adding a lot of anxiety on all of us. And that's why also I think the Minister of Health was saying, we also need to start looking at this part of, how do we, what sort of service do we provide so those people who really need to have some psychological support, because more and more people will actually come into that space where they need to be supported. Otherwise, really, the anxiety itself will make us all feel, put us in a situation where we even start to behave in some irrational manners, simply because we are feeling so closed up into this hole. It will take some time, but it is important that we need to start actually thinking about how do we then help those also who need to be psychological help, to deal with the grief they are going through. And that is why, for me, I find it really highly irresponsible when you see the deliberate messaging that people put on social media to do with this pandemic. Messages that are misleading as to how people should behave, as to what people should do. It's really highly irresponsible. Really, given what it is we are going through, and you still have people who feel this is just something we can play around with. But yes, I think we have lost a number of people. We have lost our leaders, and if we do not then act in more and more responsible manners, unfortunately, we may then just continue on that path. I really do hope that we, all of us, realize that prevention is always much better than cure.
Thank you, Minister. Connected to that, John, is the fact that these deaths are mostly among the older members of society, who are mostly pensioners, and their death could, in many circumstances, mean individual households are losing breadwinners because they were receiving, for example, their monthly old age grant, and they are losing it now because of that. So just again, this tells us that this virus is dreadful in every way possible.
Yeah, I think, Toivo, just before coming to your specific question, I just want to emphasize the message that the minister said about spreading of misinformation. And one key misinformation is also on the vaccine. I think that one we have to debunk, and we have to encourage people to go for the vaccine. If you look at, for example, the statistics of people that have succumbed to COVID, most of them were not vaccinated. There are cases where people have been vaccinated, but they have succumbed. But statistically, it's not significant, if I can use that statistical expression, because every death is significant. So I think that's one we have to debunk. The other one is also, I'm now also challenging you when we say mostly old people. When I look at the numbers, the daily reports that we get, you find it cuts across. Many people are quite young. They are succumbing to COVID, 40 years old, 41, 50. So it's not only the elderly, it's actually many people that are in the prime of their lives that are also succumbing to COVID. So that idea that it's only elderly people, it's a bit misplaced. But just coming back to your question, that yes, definitely for the elderly, your point is also valid, because many of the elderly, in Namibia, one of the biggest social safety nets we have is the old age pension grant. And I recall that the NSA some few years ago did a study on the effectiveness of different social grants on reducing poverty. And one of the key findings was that where you give a grant to pensioners, it has the highest poverty reducing impact, because the elderly, they have a better way of spending money. In fact, let me just retract what they said. The highest poverty reducing effect was on childhood poverty, because grandparents, they will spend the money on their grandchildren. They will take their grandchildren to school. They will buy shoes for their grandchildren. And now with that income falling away especially for those households where the elderly, where the source of income was mainly the old age pension. That is going to have a huge impact on poverty at a household and also poverty for children.
Thank you, John. Before we go to the break, the next break, I still want to engage Minister Tom Alweendo, and maybe we will continue with this particular subject after the break. But the Namibia's classification as an upper middle income country, the president has been on record so many times, even before he became president, that it was in so many ways disadvantaging the country. And I think people laughed and said, oh, the president is begging to be poor, he's begging for the country to be poor. But now the chickens have come home to roost. We are now seeing why it was important for the classification to be correct. Do you agree with the president in some way in that regard, Minister?
Thank you, Toivo. The classification of countries of economies into low income, middle income, upper income is a classification that obviously is used mostly by the World Bank in terms of how the World Bank provides services to its shareholder nations. Those services could be in terms of how they lend money to them. It could be in terms of how they assist them. And usually, if a country is classified to be a poor country and therefore either a low middle income country, the services are usually costed differently, much lower than how the cost would be for the upper middle income countries. And therefore, in that respect, it's true that as much as Namibia's per capita income is higher, therefore making it to look like it's a middle income country, we still have a lot of inequality in terms of how that income is distributed, and therefore it has got a point when you say simply because of that dividing the income into the population, and therefore we say that is how the country should be ranked. It does, in a way, disadvantage us. Right now, for example, the fiscal position of the country obviously is really in a very, very precarious position. The resources, the financial resources that we need to be able to fight this pandemic is not always available, and therefore we need to go and borrow that from somewhere else. And therefore, if you will have to approach lenders who are going to look at you as an income country and say to you, since you are not as poor, we are going to ask you more for us to provide this service or for us to lend this money to you. Obviously, that is, it has got a negative consequences such that then it may not put us in a position where we can access some of those financial resources. So there is a point to be made to say it cannot be correct to assess the country's development position in terms of simply looking at income. And hopefully things could change, because I know, for example, the UN has got this Human Development Index, which is more a comprehensive index, which does not only look at about the income. It looks about health issues, look about education issues. It looks at so many other social issues that also then form that comprehensive index to say, if the countries in that the index looks like this, we can then classify them. So I think there's still a push where, in terms of providing services, we should really try and move away from only looking at income, but looking at, like, as I say, the UN Human Development Index that is much more comprehensive than just income index.
Thank you, Minister. We are going for a quick break and we'll be back.
Make sure you catch Africa Good Morning every weekday from 7 a.m. to 8 a.m. with a rerun from 8 a.m. to 9 a.m. hosted by Aina Raizakweyo and myself, Ashwin Dedi, as we bring you all the news you need to know happening in the SADC region and beyond.
We are on the final stretch now. John, building on my question to the minister earlier on, we have we are in a situation where, of course, we have to sometimes borrow money. I think we recently borrowed quite a huge chunk of money to help combat this virus. And most development financial institutions will look at your classification and say, oh, Namibia is an upper middle income country, and therefore we charge them this much in terms of the interest and everything. Is that problematic, the classification?
I think, Toivo, is compiled. GDP is not the best concept to measurement, and therefore GDP per capita cannot reflect the true developmental status of any country. Apart from the issue of this distribution that the minister mentioned, there are also other flaws in the GDP calculation. For example, the more you exploit the environment, the higher the GDP, but it's not sustainable. So I don't want to go into all the flaws of the GDP per capita measurement, but it's definitely flawed. And I see there's now growing consensus that we should also include, for example, environmental accounts and other factors in GDP, so that we have a better way of measuring progress and development. But of course, one of the key issues in the classification that Namibia has always fought is that it doesn't account distribution, which is the so-called Gini coefficient. But even Gini coefficient is not sufficient. It's not to show the skewness in distribution. So we need to come up with other measures as well to measure access and distribution of not only money, but all sorts of things that we need as human beings to have a good quality of life. But having said that, Toivo, I think we must also be a bit more honest and say that we are not the only country that's classified as upper middle income. We are not the only. But are they having the same challenges that we have? So I think if you look, for example, at an economy like, and it's difficult to get, but if I look, for example, at an economy like Seychelles, they are upper middle income, but they have the highest penetration rate of vaccines compared to any country in the world. So there, the status of upper middle income did not count against them. Apart from distribution, we have two challenges that I see. It's of allocation and prioritization. If you forget for a moment just about GDP and you look at revenue that we collect, Namibia collects in relative terms the highest revenue compared to any other upper middle income country. But so the challenge is not the revenue that we collect. The challenge is how do we allocate that revenue and how do we prioritize? I think this is again a lesson that we've been aware of. We have to stop and do reviews on expenditure and see, do we get the best for the dollar that we spend, or are there still wastages that we have not picked up? And I think if we do that, we can maybe do a bit better. Coming back to the cost of capital, yes and no. Maybe that thing for me of a zero cost to capital doesn't exist. That is what we call a grant. A grant is where you don't borrow money, you get a grant, but it comes with conditions. But you find that many upper middle income countries that and developed countries that are even not upper middle but highly developed, their cost of capital is actually cheaper. Exactly because they have, for example, ratings, and it's like just not at a national level, but at a nation level, you will be surprised that I'm if I have a higher income status, I can get better conditions to credit than if I have a lower income status. So I think we have to use that also as an advantage to reduce our cost of borrowing. So that's my view on the upper middle income status. It cuts kind of both ways. Yes, now there is a case where we can't get vaccines. We have to pay for it. Also, the question is, could we have planned better? I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
John, thank you, John. I think, of course, as much as being an upper middle income country comes with its own price to pay, ideally you want to be indeed an upper income country, middle income country, or even better. But of course, you want that the reflection of that to be correct. Minister, as we edge towards the end of this conversation, uh, what are the lessons that we have learned from your perspective from the dreadful virus that is 19, this pandemic? What are the lessons that we've learned from this, and which ones are worth preserving going forward?
Okay. Before I answer that, just one or two words on again on the issue of the middle income status. I don't believe the World Bank has got any intention of classifying us into how the numbers work, unless of course we simply fall back into the lower rank, the way they calculate it. And therefore, the question is, what do we do then? And as John said, this is actually a double-edged sword. There are, having been classified this or the other, there are favorable and unfavorable consequences. For example, when you are classified as a low-income country, and you decide to go and borrow from the international markets, you are going to incur a much higher borrowing cost than somebody who is classified as an upper middle income. And therefore, in that scenario, there's a benefit of being classified as an upper middle income country as opposed to be classified as a lower income countries, if you need to borrow from the international markets. And at times, when you are classified as an upper middle income country as well, you might also have got a rating, for example, like Namibia has got a rating, although in deteriorating, but we do have a rating that allowed us also to borrow at a much affordable borrowing cost than other people. On the other hand, though, if you need to get a grant, you can only get a grant if you are classified as a low income country. And therefore, that's why Namibia does not get those grants. And that's a disadvantage. But I would also probably say the grant sometimes the low income countries get, it comes with so many conditions, such that those conditions basically does not allow you enough room to get out of that classification. It's almost keep you in that category because the conditions are such that you are not allowed to do certain things. So it's really a double-edged sword. And for me, I will probably say, well, now that the World Bank is not likely to reclassify us, we need to do things differently. We need to, and as they say, necessity is the invention, is the mother of all invention. Now that we need to do something differently, we just need to be a little bit more innovative in terms of how we go forward. Now, with regard to the lessons, I think we've learned. I mean, for me, there are two lessons, and the first one is that as humans, we sometimes think that we are in control of everything. We've got technology, we have got all these things, and therefore we can actually deal with life as it comes. But I think this particular pandemic has again reminded us that it's not true that as human beings we are always in control of what is happening around us. Yes, we can mitigate what happens. We need to have systems that are to have technology. We need to have all those things in place. I really think we need to start to agree that we are not always in control of what happens. The second lessons I've learned is that as humans, we continue to depend on each other. The idea that I can be on my own as an individual or as a country or as a community, it doesn't work. It doesn't really all go well. And when we recognize depend on each other's, it makes us to put us in a position where whatever it is I'm doing as an individual or as a society or as an economy or as a country, I must always bear in mind that my actions today can impact somebody else, even if that was not the intention. My action invariably impact on other people's positions where they are. And therefore, that interdependency, we need to agree that it's there. We survive, we exist because of other people. And therefore, let's continue to make sure that at least within society, be helpful, be considerate, know that what I'm doing has an impact on other people. And therefore, for me, really, those are the two lessons that have stood out for me.
Thank you, Minister. I like I particularly like your last point, that codependence, because there's absolutely no way, for example, that we are going to overcome this virus, this pandemic, if there's no, if we're not holding hands as a country, as a community, as even an international community to overcome it, because there's no point in Zambia, as an example, overcoming the virus completely and then survive when they are surrounded by countries that are swimming in the pool of COVID-19. John, I'm giving you the honor of making the final throw of the dice, and that is really to pose the same question to you as I did to Tom on the lessons learned, but also how do we prepare for the next crisis?
Thank you, Toivo. I think the lessons learned for me is the COVID has yet again shown challenges that we were aware of. Many of the things that came out are things that we have not, it's not new to some extent. So it just emphasizes some of the things we were already aware of. It emphasizes to me the message that we need to do some reforms, and it's better to do reforms at the pace that we can manage. The next might come, and then the adjustment will be even worse. So we have to get our expenditure mix right. We're talking about big reforms like civil service reform, this reform, that reform. We've been talking about making the shifting this growth driver from into the private. So now we must act with more urgency because the next crisis is around the corner. It's not necessarily going to be COVID, but it will come, and we can still use this opportunity to prepare our economy to be better prepared from a growth perspective to face the next crisis. And one of the calls we've said for many times now is that we have to get our mix right. We have to make it easier for the business sector to thrive. We have to reduce the dependency of the economy from a government growth economy to an economy led by the private sector. And I want to underscore that key message that Minister also said of the co-dependency, that the time for the private sector to review their business practices and to really take a call if they become also too dependent on just government contracts, or is there something private sector can also do to have more sustainable business models. So I think this for me is the key lesson, that this just emphasizing things we have been aware of, but now we need to not just plan, but also to execute and to follow through with our plans.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much, Minister Tom Alweendo, for making time really on a relatively short notice to be a panel on the show tonight, and thank you for your invaluable input tonight. And to Dr. Steytler also the same kind of words. Thank you very much for participating tonight. I think you have enlightened my viewers in ways that I cannot describe tonight. So I can't thank you enough for participating, but have a good week ahead.
Thank you very much, Toivo. And my last word again, at least, is just again
Yes.
to say the pandemic is here. Yes. We have got individual responsibility management, and please, all of us that are eligible for vaccination to go and get our vaccination. Thank you very much, Toivo.
Thank you, Minister. The message for vaccination cannot be overemphasized. Again, gentlemen, thank you very much for your time. John.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a good night.